Welcome to this series exploring innovation, progress, and achievement using a technocentric paradigm by Ash Stuart.
You may want to also read Ash's original Substack article for the best experience, including footnotes and other details.
Episode 25, Part B. One Step for Man, Three Giant Leaps for Mankind. When mobile marvels beat marble mansions. I last finished by making the point that despite a great number of innovations of the peoples of the Eurasian Steppe, their achievements haven't been given the recognition they are due. I also suggested that their institutional achievements were on an even grander scale than their artefactual ones. Allow me to complete my case. This is thus, in essence, the third part of a trilogy, the story of 1. The Proto-Indo-Europeans, who we covered in depth in episode 15. Then their descendants, 2. The Proto-Indo-Iranians, or Aryans, based on their own self-designation. And then 3. One of their descendant groups, the so-named Scythians. Effectively 3 epical generations, each roughly a millennium from the predecessor. I made the point that much of the historiographical issue here originates from the fact that whenever semi-nomadic peoples come into history, their story has been written by the sedentary populations they've come in contact with. The outsiders, who were not writing the histories of these peoples for our consumption in the modern day, but driven by their own needs, perspectives, and agendas. Don't get me wrong, it might appear that I'm discrediting Herodotus, the father of history himself. Herodotus can indeed be credited as having pioneered the field of historical analysis, and to be fair, he takes pains to mention time and again that some account of his to follow was based on what he heard from third-party sources, and it's his intent to report as accurately as possible, etc., etc. But it has been established by modern scholars that the farther away the realm of some account of his, the more fantastical Herodotus gets. I thus spoke of the need for rebalancing the ever-held view, both by the ancients, but to a good extent into our own times, that these semi-nomadic pastoralists, including the later Aryans entering the Indian subcontinent, were savage, warmongering marauders and pillagers, and were no good in anything concerning the affairs of the so-called civilized world. Here the word ancient includes both histories of the West or Near East, such as the Greeks, Assyrians, and Persians, but also the Chinese at the other end of the steppe spectrum. So let's explore the institutional achievements of this steppe trio as promised. When giving is getting.
The Proto-Indo-European word giostis is the origin of our word guest, but it's also the origin of the word host, Latin hostis. And guess what? In PIE, the same word had both those meanings. This may seem odd to us, but it goes to the very heart of a very fundamental institution of the Proto-Indo-Europeans and their 2 descendant peoples mentioned. This is the institution of guest-host reciprocity. This is not just a linguistic coincidence. Studies in other dimensions, in particular, extensive archaeological research of grave goods of these people, indicate the presence of an elaborate reciprocal gift-giving and hospitality tradition practiced by these steppe peoples. Let's remind ourselves that these people inhabited or lived and moved across vast tracts of land, and often, when you're on the move, you need to stop by somewhere for the night. This was one of the factors that led to the institutionalization of what is just a simple idea of hospitality. The PIE word giostis could also connote stranger. By the way, no connection to our word ghost, which derives from an entirely different root. You could say this was a formalization of the you scratch my back, I scratch yours principle. The idea itself being known across human societies, indeed even prevalent amongst our primate cousins, where it manifests literally. But even though we might all broadly understand and even expect some degree of reciprocity in our social affairs, for the PIE folk and their steppe descendants, it was fundamental, even sacred in its application. And this was no simple man-to-man affair. If I hosted you for a few days, it's not just me who is entitled to the reciprocal hosting another time, but it could be my kin or offspring. Yes, the Gostis principle was extensible and inheritable kinswise. This was further enhanced by and tied to their notions of prestige and status. For when you were entertaining a stranger come guest, come future host, or simply just ostis, you would carry out an elaborate gift-giving as an expression of your own status, buttressed by your wealth, power, and means. This ties back to the notion of kleos we explored in some detail back in the pie episode. You wanted to be heard far and wide, your status known, loud and clear, across the expanse of the vast steppe.
Word is thicker than blood.
A third institutional element fundamental to the three steppe groups here is an elaborate system of patron-client and alliance kinship relationships which went hand in hand with the Gostis and Kleos institutions. In the interaction between different individuals, in particular, where they were not socio-economic equals, the higher status person and his kin would offer protection, pasture rights, plunder share to the other person of lesser means and his kin in exchange for loyalty, military service, labor, or tribute. Let's make a note that this was also extended to newer peoples they encountered outside their ethno-linguistic makeup. Furthermore, the hospitality events between Gostis and Gostis could often also involve not just personal bonding and alliance-making, but even the cementing of alliances by way of marriage. One Gostis would give the other Gostis his daughter, thus cementing their alliance for generations to come. Again, this was not limited to existing ethnic boundaries. This last point I've repeated needs further emphasis. The patron-client and kinship alliances, the Proto-Indo-Europeans, the Proto-Indo-Iranians, and the Scythians cemented, and this persisted even later in other closely related descended groups. I'll give a concrete example of this in the next episode. Were not based on existing blood ties or ethno-linguistic identities or other ethnic, or as some people, especially in the US, might say, racial factors. The only requirements were loyalty and the presence or adoption of the overall sociocultural package that encapsulated the above elements. Yes, that was what mattered. Let's take the Proto-Indo-Iranian groups, for example, who, as we've seen above, developed the notion of Aryan identity. For them, Aryanhood meant conformity to these sociocultural values and practices. If you adopted these practices, you were in, and that was it. Yes, that was that. Let's say this out loud and clear. To be an Aryan was a sociocultural choice, not an ethnic or racial designation.
Writing a tale badly told.
Given this cultural background of these three epical generations of steppe people, let me now discuss how these were different from the so-called civilized peoples, so as to follow through on my express goal of redressing the historical misrepresentation of steppe peoples, the disregard or diminution of their sheer scale of innovation in their artefactual and institutional technologies, even the outright stigmatization of their cultures and values. In ecological terms, the steppes are a very challenging place. The temperature and other environmental changes can be sudden and extreme. As we know very well, the steppes, stretching from Mongolia and northern China in the east to Slovakia and Hungary in the west, is an extremely vast stretch of grassland spanning continents, with essentially no real natural borders anywhere across this expanse. In such a backdrop, these steppe peoples developed an extraordinary mobility. This was, as we have seen, literally off the back of horses and horsepower and related technologies. but also a host of institutions they developed and refined over time.
Wordsworth overwrit.
The hostess institution was their way of not just building alliances, but also functioned as a property rights system, since it helped divide grazing lands amongst the different groups interacting, as a risk management and insurance system. The patron-client system extended some of these benefits and added to their ability to influence outside groups who could be incorporated without ethnic factors coming into play.
Contrast that with so-called democratic Athens, where only ethnic Greeks, both paternally and maternally so certified, qualified as citizens.
Doesn't this mean that quite often the economic attraction of the Indo-European system was sufficient to lure outside groups in wanting to take part in the system, meaning avoidance of wars and other conflict in many cases? How does that compare with our sedentary ancients' view of these being marauding and pillaging savage nomads? I'm not saying there was no conflict or even brutality, but they did have enough carrots, ensuing fewer occasions to have to use the sticks, didn't they? And perhaps some of the cases of violent conflict we see reported by the sedentary peoples came about because they, the sedentary groups, in their arrogance of calling themselves the civilized ones, refused to cooperate, didn't it? Lest this gets too lengthy, I haven't even touched upon how extensive the trade links were between, for example, the Scythians and the Greeks, or more than a millennium before them, the still in Central Asia Aryans and the magnificent Bactria Margiana urban civilization. But consider this example. I mentioned in the previous part that trousers, pants, were an innovation by the Scythians. We know from the movies, if no other source, that the ancient Greeks and Romans draped curtains. I mean, robes around their bodies. The latter said to have looked upon the Greeks in such clothing as a sort of emblem of civilization. These people thought trousers were ridiculous and even disdained them. They thought the horse-mounted nomads were pants, but who had the last laugh on this one?
Redeeming the misdeemed, in word, indeed.
We have seen how the Proto-Indo-Europeans, who emerged in 3300 BC between the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea, spread culturally, genetically, and linguistically across corners of Eurasia from India to Ireland. Subsequent to their emergence in the Sintashta, the Aryans, at their largest extent, spread across the entire zone we call the Andronovo horizon, before heading south, as mentioned, and the Scythians, present in the historical record, are known to have built vast, multi-ethnic, multilingual confederations. But they didn't live in a vacuum. They interacted and traded with the neighboring sedentary populations, adopting many ideas from them, but also, importantly, they spread many of their ideas and technologies, as we've seen in this episode and in the PIE one. Let's quickly recap the innovations and achievements, the ideas and technologies of these three peoples for perspective.
Proto-Indo-Europeans, 3,300 to 2,800 BC. The Founding Fathers.
Mastered horse domestication and riding, revolutionizing human mobility across vast grasslands, integrated the wheel into functional wagon technology, enabling long-distance transport, adopted Bronze Age metallurgy and weaponry, crafting tools that broke bones better than sticks and stones, adapted to adult dairy consumption, creating mobile, refrigerated food storage, through livestock, developed rotational pastoral systems, enabling sustainable occupation of challenging grassland environments, established the Gehostes, institution of reciprocal guest-host relationships, creating alliance networks across continents, developed Kleos, concept of fame and reputation, driving expansion and cultural transmission, developed the patron-client model, serving to incentivize and integrate outside groups into their fold as an alternative to purely military conquest and subjugation, carrots rather than sticks. spread linguistically, culturally, and genetically from the British Isles to the Indian subcontinent, leaving traces in thousands of modern words spoken by half the global population today.
Proto-Indo-Iranians, the early Aryans, 2200 to 1700 BC, the craftful shapers.
Invented the spoked wheel, a conceptual leap from solid wheels to lightweight spoke and rim design. Developed horse-drawn chariots, achieving unprecedented speed and agility in warfare. Bred Equus cabalis into prominence, the larger, more powerful but docile horse lineage that dominates to this day. Established industrial-scale metallurgy at Sintashta, rivaling contemporary Near Eastern civilizations. Built heavily fortified settlements at times of duress while maintaining nomadic flexibility. Expanded across the Andronovo horizon, a 3,000-kilometer territory from the Urals to western China, creating the largest, coherent cultural zone of the Bronze Age. Established the Steppe Route, a 10,000-kilometer trade network 2 millennia before the Silk Road. Defined Aryan identity as sociocultural choice, not ethnic, racial designation. Inclusivity over exclusivity.
Scythians, 1000 to 300 BC, the mighty wielders.
Perfected single-rider horse-mounted archery with accuracy exceeding 500 meters and at 10 to 12 arrows per minute. Crafted advanced composite bows representing the apex of pre-gunpowder projectile technology. Innovated saddles and trousers, gear adopted by horsemen worldwide. Pioneered decimal military organization and confederated political structures spanning vast territories. Developed even more sophisticated environmental management through rotational grazing and controlled burning techniques. Built vast multi-ethnic, multilingual confederations spanning continents. Established extensive trade networks with sedentary populations from Greece to China. Originated techniques like the Parthian shot, influencing warfare for millennia. Given all this, are we right in calling these people any less civilized? It's hard to even pose that question. Our notion of so-called civilization itself comes from urban dwelling and citizenship, Latin civis, alongside the connotations of words like civil. Why is it that when we talk about the great cultures of antiquity, the great innovations of the ancients, the great institutions of history, why is it that we talk about ancient Greek or Mesopotamian or Chinese or other cultures and their marble mansions, but we don't even mention these mobile marvels?